He was just a mechanic. They made sure everyone knew it. What they didn't know was going to kill them all. A billionaire CEO. A private jet worth $40 million. A navigation system quietly hijacked by someone already on board. And one quiet man in a gray coverall who saw every warning sign coming and was laughed out of the cabin for it. Logan Mercer had buried his past so deep that even his daughter didn't know the full truth. But 30,000 feet above the earth, with 2 Air Force fighters closing in and a corrupted system pulling the aircraft toward restricted military airspace, the past was about to surface whether he wanted it to or not. If you're watching this, hit like, drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now let's begin. The morning Logan Mercer found the fault, he almost didn't say anything. Not because he was afraid. Not because he wasn't sure. He was sure. He'd been sure the moment he pulled up the maintenance log and saw the navigation update flagged with a certification code that didn't match any FAA database he'd ever accessed. And he'd accessed more than most people in his line of work ever would. The code was wrong. The timestamp was wrong. And the technician who'd signed off on it had signed off 4 minutes after the previous entry, which was physically impossible given the scope of the work listed. Logan stood on the tarmac at Whitmore Executive Airfield outside of Richmond, Virginia, and stared at his tablet and did the math again. Then he set the tablet down on the edge of the fuel cart and looked at the aircraft in front of him. A Gulfstream G700, tail number N4477VX, owned by Ashford Industries, registered in Delaware, scheduled for departure at 11:45 a.m. He looked at his watch. It was 9:12. He picked the tablet back up. "You seeing this?" he said. Marcus Webb, his inspection partner, didn't look up from the portside engine cowling he was photographing. Marcus was 53, had been doing aircraft inspections for 22 years, and had the posture of a man who'd spent most of those years bent over things at odd angles. "Seeing what?" "Navcom update. Filed 2 days ago. Certification stamp is from an FAA office in Tulsa." "Okay. There's no FAA certification office in Tulsa." Marcus stopped photographing. He walked around the nose of the aircraft and looked over Logan's shoulder. Logan watched him read it twice. Marcus had a habit of reading technical documents twice, not because he was slow, but because the first read was for information and the second read was for disbelief. "That's not right," Marcus said. "No." "You sure there's no see? I checked. There's a Flight Standards District office in Oklahoma City, nothing in Tulsa." Marcus handed the tablet back. "Write it up. Tell the ground crew, get it to the chief liaison, and we're done. They either scrub the departure, or they get someone from the manufacturer out here to verify the update in person. Simple." Logan nodded. That was the right call. That was the clean, professional, correct response to what was in front of them. Write it up, flag it, walk away. The liability wasn't theirs. Meridian Aviation Insurance had hired Mercer Webb Technical to perform a pre-departure inspection, not to ground Billionaire's jets or get into arguments with corporate flight departments. He wrote it up. The argument that followed was not with the corporate flight department. The liaison who came out to meet him was a man named Devereaux. No first name offered, just Devereaux, in a black suit that was slightly too warm for a Virginia morning in early October. He had the practiced calm of someone whose entire professional value was absorbing friction before it reached the people who paid him. "Mr. Mercer," Devereaux said, reading from the tablet Logan had handed him with the expression of someone reading a parking ticket. "You're flagging the Navcom update. The certification is invalid. The FAA office listed doesn't exist. The update was performed by ClearPath Avionics, who are an authorized. The authorization code on the update is tied to a non-existent issuing office. That makes the certification invalid, regardless of who performed the work. That aircraft should not fly until someone from ClearPath or from the manufacturer can physically verify that the update installed correctly." Devereaux handed the tablet back. "I'll pass this along. I'd like to speak to whoever makes the departure decision." A pause. Just half a beat, but Logan caught it. "That would be Ms. Ashford." "Then I'd like to speak to Ms. Ashford." He waited 40 minutes on the tarmac. Marcus sat in the inspection van and ate a sandwich. Logan stood near the nose of the aircraft in the thin October sun and watched the ground crew move around him with the quiet efficiency of people who had been told to look busy. The aircraft was being provisioned, catering loaded through the aft galley door, luggage transferred from 2 black SUVs, fuel levels rechecked. Everything moved except the departure clock, which Logan was still watching when the terminal door opened and Victoria Ashford walked out. She was 30 years old, and she moved like someone who had learned very early that the space around her was hers to organize. She wore a charcoal blazer over a silk blouse, dark trousers, heels that were aggressive but not impractical, and the look of someone who had already been interrupted 3 times this morning by things beneath her attention. She was followed by 2 men in suits carrying laptops and a woman with a headset who appeared to be conducting 3 phone calls simultaneously. Behind them came 4 other people, older men, the kind whose suits announced their wealth quietly, the way expensive things don't need to shout. Investors, Logan guessed. The kind of meeting where you fly people somewhere to remind them that you have a jet to fly them in. Victoria Ashford glanced at Logan the way you glance at a rental car, briefly, functionally, without particular interest. Then she looked at Devereaux. "He's the mechanic," she said. "Inspection contractor," Devereaux said, from Meridian. He flagged the Navcom certification. "I read the summary." She turned to Logan. "Mr. Mercer. Miss Ashford. Walk me through the issue." He walked her through it. He kept it clear and sequential. The log timestamp, the certification code, the non-existent issuing office. He used plain language. He'd learned a long time ago that technical complexity rarely persuaded anyone of anything. What persuaded people was clarity. If you couldn't make it simple, you didn't understand it well enough. She listened. She didn't interrupt, which he took as a sign of intelligence or experience or both. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "ClearPath Avionics has serviced our fleet for 4 years. I understand that. This isn't about ClearPath's track record. It's about a specific update on this specific aircraft with a certification code that doesn't correspond to any FAA-registered office. The issue is the paperwork, not the company. And your recommendation is to scrub today's departure. My recommendation is to verify the update before departure. That might take a few hours. It might take longer, but it needs to happen." One of the men in suits behind her, with silver hair not quite disguising his boredom, leaned toward another and said something quiet. Logan didn't catch it, but he caught the tone. He was familiar with that tone. It was the tone of men who found caution slightly embarrassing. Victoria said, "Mr. Mercer, this aircraft is maintained by one of the most reputable avionics firms in the country. It passed its last FAA inspection 6 weeks ago, and I have a meeting in New York in 4 hours that involves a contract worth approximately $2.4 billion. She said this as if she were explaining traffic patterns to someone who'd never driven a car. A clerical inconsistency in a maintenance record does not constitute grounds for delaying that meeting. A clerical inconsistency in a maintenance record once caused a freight carrier in Ohio to lose an aircraft and 4 crew members because nobody checked whether the paperwork matched the actual work. The woman with the headset looked up briefly, then went back to her calls. "Are you threatening me?" Victoria said. Not hostile, genuinely curious, as if she wanted to calibrate what kind of problem she was dealing with. "I'm telling you what the inspection found. And I'm telling you that Ashford Industries will take the matter under advisement and has no intention of altering today's schedule based on a certification discrepancy that our legal team will review before we land." She said it with the cleanness of someone who had ended conversations for a living. "Devereaux, make sure Mr. Mercer receives his full inspection fee. Mr. Mercer," she looked at him one more time, the same brief functional look as before. "Thank you for your thoroughness." She turned and walked toward the aircraft. Logan said, "Ms. Ashford?" She paused, but didn't turn around fully. Half a turn. The minimum acknowledgement. "You have 12 people boarding that aircraft," he said. "Whatever the meeting is worth, it's worth less than that." The silver-haired investor made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Victoria looked at Logan for a moment. Something unreadable moved behind her eyes. Something that wasn't quite contempt, but was close. And then she said, "Devereaux." And that was the end of it. Logan stood on the tarmac and watched them board. Hot. He should have driven away. Marcus had the van running. The inspection was complete. The report was filed, and the decision belonged to Victoria Ashford and her legal team, and whatever actuarial calculus they ran on the difference between a delayed meeting and a navigation system that hadn't been properly certified. It wasn't Logan's aircraft. It wasn't Logan's risk. It wasn't Logan's call. He told Marcus he needed to make one more check and he'd be 5 minutes. Marcus sighed. Logan, 5 minutes. He went back to the aircraft, not the main door, which the ground crew had already buttoned up, but the avionics access panel on the forward underbelly, which was still open from the earlier inspection. He crouched under the nose, pulled out his tablet, connected the diagnostic cable to the aircraft data port, and ran the navcom system check again. The first run had shown the certification issue. This run showed something else. The update wasn't just uncertified. It had been modified after installation. Logan sat on the tarmac under a $40 million jet and looked at what the diagnostic was showing him and tried to think of a legitimate reason why a navigation software package would be modified post-installation without any corresponding maintenance log entry. He tried to think of a reasonable explanation for why the modified timestamp on the routing subroutine was 14 hours after ClearPath's technician had signed off and left the facility. He tried to think of who would have had access to the aircraft in that 14-hour window. He was still thinking when the ground crew supervisor came around the nose and asked him to clear the area because they were closing the access panel. "Wait," Logan said. "Who had access to this aircraft 2 nights ago, between midnight and 6 a.m.? The supervisor frowned. "That's not something I can just... I need to know who had access to this aircraft in that window." "Sir, I need you to..." "I understand, but look at what I'm showing you." He held up the tablet. This navigation update was modified after the original installation, 14 hours after the licensed technician signed off and left. That means someone with technical access and a reason to alter the routing came back to this aircraft and made changes that nobody logged. That's not a clerical inconsistency. That's a problem. The supervisor looked at the tablet with the expression of a man who was aware that his job was to get the aircraft off the ground, not to interpret avionics data. "I'll need to contact whoever you need to, but do it before that door closes." Inside the terminal, waiting for the ground crew supervisor to reach someone with authority, Logan called Marcus. "Run a search," he said. "Restricted military airspace within 300 miles of here. Anything active." "Logan, we're done. The report is filed. Whatever happens next is..." "Marcus?" A pause. Marcus knew that tone. It was the tone Logan used when the thing he was looking at had stopped being a professional concern and become something else. When the instinct under the professional vocabulary started pushing up through the careful, measured language of inspection reports and liability assessments. Marcus had worked with Logan for 3 years. He didn't know everything about Logan's past. Logan didn't share everything about Logan's past, but he knew enough to know that when Logan's voice went quiet and certain like that, you ran the search. "Give me 2 minutes," Marcus said. Logan leaned against the terminal wall and watched through the glass as the boarding door on the Gulfstream sealed shut. His jaw tightened just once, a small, involuntary thing he couldn't help. Marcus came back in 90 seconds. "There's a restricted military zone that went active 48 hours ago, Hawthorne Military Coordination Area. It's been flagged in the NOTAMs since Tuesday. Where does it sit relative to the standard New York routing from here?" 20 miles south of it. If the navigation system were routing 15 degrees off course from the standard heading, where does that put the aircraft? A longer pause. "Logan, where does it put it?" "Directly into the restricted zone." Marcus's voice had changed. "You're saying someone reconfigured the routing to steer them into military airspace?" "I'm saying someone modified the navigation software after the certified installation and didn't log it. I'm saying the deviation in the routing subroutine is exactly the kind of subtle drift that would push the aircraft off the standard flight path over a period of about 40 minutes. Slowly enough that the crew might not catch it until they were already inside the restricted zone, at which point Air Force Command would establish emergency intercept contact and the aircraft would be stuck in the middle of a military response with a navigation system they can't trust and a crew that doesn't know why they're there. That's... Marcus stopped. "That's a lot of things that could go wrong." "That's what I'm saying." The ground crew supervisor appeared at his elbow. "Mr. Mercer, my operations director says the aircraft is cleared for departure and our facility's role in pre-inspection is complete. He's asking you to return the diagnostic equipment and clear the apron." Logan looked at him. Then he looked back through the glass at the Gulfstream, which had just received the tow clearance signal and was beginning to move. He had 6 minutes, maybe 7, before it reached the runway. What happened next, Logan would think about later and call it a failure of judgment. Not the decision itself. The decision was correct, or at least it was the decision he would make again, but the execution. He moved too fast and he didn't think clearly about how he looked. He looked like a man in a gray coverall pushing past a ground crew supervisor and running toward an aircraft that was already moving. He got as far as the terminal exit before 2 Whitmore security officers caught him, and he had the presence of mind not to fight them because fighting security officers on an airfield in sight of a departing aircraft was the fastest way to end up in handcuffs and on a federal watch list. He stopped moving and he showed them his hands, and he talked as calmly as he could manage, while the Gulfstream rolled toward the runway and the seconds moved in the way seconds move when you're watching something you can't stop. "My name is Logan Mercer. I'm a licensed A&P mechanic. I'm contracted by Meridian Aviation Insurance. That aircraft has a compromised navigation system. I need you to contact the tower and request a hold." The first officer had his hand on Logan's arm. "Sir, I'm going to need you to call the tower. Request a hold on Gulfstream tail number November 4477, Victor X-ray. Tell them there's a navigation discrepancy that wasn't cleared before departure. That's all I'm asking." The officer looked at his partner. The partner looked at the Gulfstream, which had reached the runway hold line. "Please," Logan said. Not because please was in his nature, because it was the word that fit the moment, and he was paying attention to what the moment needed. The second officer said, "Let me call operations." It took 4 minutes. In those 4 minutes, Logan watched the aircraft sit at the hold line, and he felt the specific grinding quality of time when you're waiting on a decision that belongs to someone else. He breathed steadily. He kept his hands visible. He didn't pace. The tower did not issue a hold. The Gulfstream received its departure clearance at 11:49 and rolled onto the runway. Logan watched it lift off. The gear retracted cleanly. The aircraft banked into a climbing left turn, heading northeast, catching the October sun on its fuselage and going bright for a moment before the angle changed. He stood at the terminal window and watched until it was gone. Bus. Marcus was waiting at the van with the engine still running. Logan got in and sat down, and there were several seconds in which neither of them said anything. "You tried," Marcus said. "It wasn't enough." "Logan, we flagged it. We put it in writing. Whatever happens next is on them. I know." He picked up the tablet from the seat between them. The diagnostic report was still open. The modified timestamp on the routing subroutine was still sitting there, the same way it had been sitting there for the past 40 minutes, quiet and certain and wrong. How long before they'd hit the zone? Marcus checked something on his phone. If the routing deviation is as consistent as you're describing, and if the crew doesn't catch the drift on their own, maybe 40, 45 minutes from wheels up. Logan looked at the time. Then we have 40 minutes. We have 40 minutes for what? To reach someone who can intercept that aircraft before it enters restricted military airspace. He was already pulling up contacts on his phone. Not the regular contacts, not Marcus's operations director or Meridian's flight risk department. Different contacts, the kind that didn't have names in the display. The kind he hadn't used in a long time. "There are things I can do that we're not going to talk about in detail. But I need you to trust me." Marcus looked at him with the expression of a man who had understood for a while that his quiet, competent inspection partner had a life he didn't share. "You know people who can stop that aircraft." "I know people who can reach the right people. It's not the same as stopping it, but it's what we have." "Logan? Who are you?" Logan's phone connected. Someone answered on the second ring. Not a voice he'd spoken to in 4 years, slightly older now, carrying the same flat professional calm he remembered. "Hendricks," said the voice. "It's Mercer. I need a channel to Air Force Eastern Command right now." A pause. "Mercer, you've been off the grid for 4 years. Yes, I'll explain later. I need the channel. I have a civilian Gulfstream, tail November 4477, Victor X-ray, 40 minutes out of Whitmore Executive, Richmond, Virginia. Navigation system has been tampered with post-certification. The routing deviation is going to put it directly into the Hawthorne MCA. The crew doesn't know it's coming. Another pause, shorter. You're certain about the modification? I have the diagnostic data. Send it to... I'm sending it now. He pulled up the data on the tablet, hit the transfer protocol that he hadn't used in 4 years but that his hand still remembered, and watched the file transfer begin. Hendricks, there are 12 people on that aircraft. I hear you. A brief muffled exchange on the other end of the call. Mercer, are you able to get on that aircraft? The question stopped him. He hadn't thought that far. He'd been thinking about the channel, about the data, about getting the warning to the right people. Not about the logical next step, which was that the navigation system would need to be manually overridden by someone who understood what had been done to it. Air Force intercept could force the aircraft to land, but landing it safely with a corrupted navigation system was a different problem. There's a corporate FBO at Patuxent River, he said. If the routing is drifting on the current heading, they'll be roughly overhead in, he did the math, 22 minutes. If there's a fast aircraft available, I'll make a call, Hendricks said. Sit tight. Logan lowered the phone and looked out the windshield. The tarmac was empty. The ground crews had gone back inside. The October sky was the particular clean blue of a morning that had nothing to apologize for. You're going after them, Marcus said. Trying. Who's Hendricks? Someone from a long time ago. Marcus nodded slowly. He'd stopped asking for fuller explanations sometime in the second year. You need a ride to Patuxent? Yeah. Good. Marcus put the van in drive. Then let's go. The drive took 19 minutes on roads Marcus pushed harder than was probably appropriate for a vehicle with Meridian Aviation Inspection printed on the side. Logan spent the time on the phone, with Hendricks twice more, once with someone he identified only as the tech office, pulling up everything he could reconstruct about the routing modification from the diagnostic data. Once with a number he'd hesitated over before dialing, sitting with the phone in his hand for a moment that Marcus pretended not to notice. He dialed it. It rang twice. Dad? The voice was young. Not very young, but 13 young, which was a particular kind of young that Logan heard in every syllable. Hey, Bug. He kept his voice level. I need to tell you something. You're not picking me up today, are you? I might not make it by 3. Is Mrs. Callahan still... She says yes, but she makes me eat the vegetable soup. Eat the soup. Dad, it has... Eat the soup, Ellie. I'll be there as soon as I can. He paused. Do you have your homework situation under control? Yes. You'd tell me if you didn't. Probably not. He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. I'll see you tonight. Stay with Mrs. Callahan. Dad. Her voice shifted a little. The 13-year-old instinct for when adults were leaving out important things. Are you okay? I'm fine. Eat the soup. He ended the call and looked out the window and didn't say anything. Marcus didn't say anything either. That was one of the things Logan had come to count on about Marcus. He knew the shape of silences, which ones needed filling and which ones didn't. Patuxent River Naval Air Station, NAS Pax River, sat on the western shore of the Chesapeake, about 60 miles south of Annapolis. Marcus knew a route. Logan didn't ask how. There was an aircraft waiting, a T-38 Talon trainer, which was not the most comfortable way to travel, and which seated 2, which meant Logan and a pilot he'd never met who introduced himself as Vasquez and shook Logan's hand with the grip of someone who had been told they were doing something unusual today and had decided to be professional about it. You're Mercer, Vasquez said. Yes. Hendricks says you have classified clearance. Had. It's been a while. Hendricks says had is good enough for today. Vasquez handed him a helmet. We have about 12 minutes before we lose the intercept window. Can you fly in 12 minutes? I've been flying since I was 22. That's not what I asked. Yes, Logan said. I can fly in 12 minutes. The T-38 lifted off at 12:17. The sky was still the same clean October blue, indifferent and enormous, and below them the Chesapeake went silver in the midday light. Logan sat in the rear seat with the helmet and the borrowed flight suit and the diagnostic data open on his phone, and he thought about the routing subroutine and what it would have done to the Gulfstream's autopilot, how it would have pulled the flight path left, gradually, in increments too small to trigger the crew's immediate attention. The way water finds the lowest point not by rushing, but by moving slightly, steadily, until suddenly you realize you're somewhere you didn't intend to be. He thought about 12 people on a jet that was being steered by a system someone had deliberately broken. He thought about a woman in a charcoal blazer who had called him a mechanic and turned her back and walked away. He thought about the fact that he was going to help her anyway. Not because of her, because of 12 people, because that was the arithmetic of it. Not a complicated arithmetic, not one that required justification. 12 people. And he was the person who understood what had been done to the aircraft, which made him the person who had to fix it. That was just the math. Vasquez's voice came through the helmet radio. "Mercer, I've got visual on the target." Logan looked out through the canopy and saw the Gulfstream, small and bright against the sky, banking in a slow left turn that it absolutely should not have been making on the standard northeast routing to New York. The navigation system was working exactly as someone intended. "She's already off course," Logan said, "by about 11 degrees. Eastern Command has established radio contact with the crew. They know something's wrong. They don't know what. They're going to need someone on board who can manually override the Navcom system. That's why you're here." "How are we getting me on board?" "We're going to ask them to open the door," Vasquez said, which was the kind of answer that contained significantly more detail than it revealed. Logan settled into his seat and checked the diagnostic data one more time and thought about what was waiting for him inside that aircraft. Not just the navigation system, not just the technical problem, but the woman who had stood on a tarmac in Richmond 3 hours ago and told him that a contract worth $2.4 billion was more important than his concerns. He thought about her face when he'd said 12 people, the way something had moved behind her eyes and then closed off. He was about to find out what was actually behind it. The T-38 drew alongside the Gulfstream, close enough that Logan could see the Ashford Industries logo on the tail. Vasquez coordinated on the radio in the terse, practiced shorthand of military aviation, and Logan listened and prepared himself, and the sky around them was very large and very blue and completely indifferent to everything that was about to happen inside that aircraft. The door began to open, and Logan Mercer, aircraft mechanic, single father, former Navy SEAL, the man they had dismissed on a tarmac in Richmond without a second thought, began to climb aboard. The door of the Gulfstream opened the way doors open when the people inside haven't decided yet whether they want you there. Grudgingly, partially, with a quality of institutional reluctance that had nothing to do with mechanics and everything to do with the fact that a man in a borrowed flight suit was climbing through it from a military trainer aircraft at 31,000 feet. Which was not a normal thing that happened to people who had boarded a private jet in Richmond for a business meeting. Logan got through the door. Vasquez held the T-38 steady for the transfer with the kind of focused, wordless professionalism that Logan recognized from another life, the life he'd spent the last 4 years not talking about. The moment his boots hit the Gulfstream's cabin floor, the door was pulled shut behind him, and the roar of the slipstream cut off, and he was standing in an aircraft cabin that smelled of leather and fresh coffee and the particular quiet wealth of people who had never once worried about the cost of fuel. 12 faces looked at him. He didn't count them. He felt them, the specific weight of a room full of people who were afraid and trying not to show it, which was a weight Logan knew intimately from rooms that had been considerably more dangerous than this one. Victoria Ashford was standing at the forward end of the cabin, near the cockpit door. She was not sitting. Logan registered that immediately. She was standing, which meant she'd been standing for a while, which meant she was the kind of person who dealt with uncertainty by refusing to be still. Her blazer was still on, still perfect, but there was something different in her face than what he'd seen on the tarmac. Something that hadn't been there when she'd turned her back and walked away. She looked at him like she was trying to place a face she'd seen briefly and chosen to forget. "Mr. Mercer," she said. "Ms. Ashford. You're—" She stopped. "You came after us." "The navigation system has been compromised. I need access to the avionics bay." She stared at him. Not the functional, dismissive glance from the tarmac. This was something else. Something that was working through several things simultaneously and hadn't landed yet. "How did you—" "Military intercept. There are 2 Air Force fighters shadowing this aircraft right now. Eastern Command has been in contact with your crew. Your captain should be able to confirm. He looked past her toward the cockpit door. Can you get me to your captain? Every minute we spend here is a minute the system keeps pulling you off course. How far off course? She asked. Her voice was different now, stripped of the corporate finish, something underneath it that was almost raw. 11 degrees as of 12 minutes ago, increasing. If it continues at the current rate, you'll cross into the Hawthorne Military Coordination Area in... He checked his watch. Approximately 28 minutes. One of the silver-haired investors said, "The Hawthorne, what does that mean exactly?" It means this aircraft will be inside restricted military airspace without clearance, with a compromised navigation system, while 2 Air Force fighters are monitoring the situation, Logan said. He kept his voice flat because flat was what the room needed right now, not emphasis, not alarm. It's a situation that can be resolved, but it needs to be resolved now. Victoria's head of security, a man Logan had noticed boarding in Richmond, big-shouldered, with the posture of someone who had done some version of this job for a long time, stepped forward. His name tag said Cole. He put himself between Logan and the cockpit door with the practiced ease of someone whose body was the first argument. "I need to verify who you are," Cole said. "Logan Mercer, A&P license number 3378 Alpha. I'm the mechanic who flagged the Navcom issue on the ground. I have diagnostic data showing the navigation system was modified post-certification by someone who had access to this aircraft in the 48 hours before departure. That's a description, not verification." Cole. Victoria said his name once, quietly. Cole looked at her. "Let him through," she said. It wasn't a performance of authority. It was something more fundamental. A decision that had already been made somewhere behind her eyes, and she was just saying it out loud. Cole stepped aside. Not happily, but he stepped aside. The cockpit was tight, the way cockpits always were, and Captain Reeves, a lean man in his late 40s with the deeply weathered patience of someone who had been flying professionally for 23 years, turned in his seat and looked at Logan with an expression that was half relief and half suspicion, which was exactly the right ratio given the circumstances. "You're Mercer," Reeves said. "Yes. Eastern Command told me you'd be coming. They also told me your diagnostic data checks out." He said this with the tone of a man who was still processing the improbability of the day. "I've been flying this route for 3 years. I didn't catch the deviation until Eastern called it in. The modification was designed to be gradual. It wouldn't have triggered your autopilot alerts until you were already inside the restricted zone." Reeves turned back to his instruments. "Co-pilot Huang has been trying to manually correct the heading, but every time we input a correction, the system reasserts the modified routing within about 90 seconds. That's consistent with what I found. The modification isn't just a setting change. It's a persistent override written into the routing subroutine. As long as that subroutine is active, any manual correction gets canceled out." Logan leaned over and looked at the navigation display. The heading was drifting, slowly, steadily, the way a tide moves. You couldn't watch it happen, but if you looked away and looked back, it had moved. "Do you have access to the Navcom maintenance terminal?" "Avionics bay, aft of the galley." "I need 15 minutes in there." Reeves looked at him. "Can you fix it?" "I can disable the modified subroutine and revert to the base navigation software. The re-verification process will take time, so you'll need to fly manual until we're clear of the zone, and I can rebuild the routing from the certified baseline." He paused. "Have you flown manual on this aircraft?" "About 1,000 hours, Reeves said, which was the answer Logan wanted to hear. "Then we're fine. Let me get to the avionics bay." "Mercer," Reeves put a hand on his arm briefly. "Eastern Command mentioned your credentials, the classified ones." Logan said nothing. "They said the FAA inspector on the channel went quiet when they read out your service record, whatever that means." Reeves was looking at him with curiosity that didn't quite tip into questions, which Logan appreciated. "I just want you to know I'm glad you're here." "Let's fix the problem first," Logan said. "Then you can be glad." Quiet. He passed back through the cabin to reach the aft avionics bay, and the investors watched him with the expressions of men who were recalibrating something. Logan didn't pay attention to that. He paid attention to the narrow door behind the galley and the equipment rack behind it, and the maintenance terminal that he was going to spend the next 15 minutes rebuilding from the inside. Victoria fell into step beside him. "I owe you an explanation," she said. "After," he said. "I'm trying to—" "Ms. Ashford." He stopped and looked at her. She was close enough that he could see the effort she was making, the controlled, deliberate effort of someone who was used to managing everything around her and was currently managing nothing. "I understand what you want to say, but the system is still running, and we're still drifting, and I need to be in that bay. Everything else waits." She held his gaze for a moment, then she nodded once. "What do you need from me?" "Keep your passengers calm. Don't tell them more than they need to know right now. And if Cole gives me any problems while I'm working, he won't." "Okay." He opened the avionics bay door and got to work. The bay was a narrow space, mostly metal, lit by the blue white of indicator lights and the glow of the maintenance terminal. Logan plugged in his diagnostic cable and pulled up the system architecture and started working through it the way you worked through something that had been deliberately messed with, methodically, without assumptions, checking each layer before moving to the next. The modification was sophisticated. Whoever had done it wasn't an amateur. The override was written in a way that mimicked legitimate software behavior, buried in a subroutine that a standard maintenance check would have passed over without flagging. If Logan hadn't been looking specifically for a post-installation modification, if he hadn't had the timestamp comparison from the ground check, he wouldn't have found it either. He found it now. He traced it back through 3 nested subroutines to the point of entry, a single line of code that had been inserted into the routing priority algorithm, a line that told the system to treat the modified heading as a hard constraint, overriding any manual input that conflicted with it. A hard constraint with a specific destination. Logan stared at the destination coordinates. He entered them manually into his phone's mapping application and waited for the result. The coordinates resolved to a point in the Hawthorne Military Coordination Area. Not just inside the zone. The specific point was the intersection of 2 active military flight corridors, the busiest intersection in the restricted airspace, the point where a civilian aircraft with no military clearance and a malfunctioning navigation system would cause the maximum possible disruption to active military operations. This wasn't just sabotage. This was calculated. Whoever had written this code wanted this aircraft in that exact spot. They'd chosen a destination that would force a military response, that would result in the aircraft being escorted down under emergency protocols, that would— He stopped. That would destroy the defense contract. If Ashford Industries' CEO arrived in New York on a jet that had been intercepted by the Air Force for violating military airspace, regardless of the reason, regardless of whether it was sabotage or incompetence, the Defense Contract Review Board would distance itself before the story was even finished being written. The optics alone would be enough. Billion-dollar defense contracts didn't survive the headline Ashford Industries jet intercepted by Air Force. They just didn't. Someone inside Ashford Industries needed that contract to fall apart. Logan made a note of the destination coordinates and went back to the subroutine and began the process of isolating it from the live system. Surgical work? The kind that required patience and precision, and he had both. He'd been patient for 4 years. He could be patient for another 12 minutes. He was 8 minutes into the isolation process when the cabin door opened and Cole came through it. "I need you to step away from the terminal," Cole said. Logan didn't look up. "Not right now." "Ms. Ashford is asking. Ms. Ashford told you I had access. I'm using that access. I need 6 more minutes." "There are investors in the cabin who are asking questions about why a military-cleared mechanic is in the avionics bay, and Ms. Ashford is managing a situation that— The situation in the cabin is a distraction," Logan said, still not looking up. "The situation in this bay is the reason the aircraft is still drifting. Let me finish." Cole was quiet for a moment. Logan could hear him breathing, the tight, controlled breath of someone who was used to being the authority in the room and wasn't comfortable with the current arrangement. "I don't know who you are," Cole said. "I don't know what your clearance actually says or what Hendricks told Eastern Command. What I know is that you showed up on my client's aircraft from a military trainer and you're alone in the avionics bay and nobody has verified anything in person. My A&P license number is 3378 Alpha. You can verify it with the FAA database from your phone in about 45 seconds. Logan finally looked up. Cole, I understand your job. Your job is to keep Victoria Ashford safe. Right now, the thing that keeps her safe is me finishing what I'm doing. So I need you to make a decision about which threat is real. Cole looked at him for a long moment. Logan held the look without hostility. Just straight and level, the way you hold a look when you mean exactly what you said and you're not trying to prove anything else. Cole stepped back and pulled the door closed. Logan went back to the subroutine. 6 minutes later, he isolated the modified code, flagged it for the system to exclude from the routing priority algorithm, and rebuilt the navigation baseline from the original certified installation package. The process wasn't perfect. He'd want a full verification on the ground before trusting the Navcom system for anything critical. But it was enough. The hard constraint was gone. The system could accept manual corrections. He called forward on the internal aircraft phone. Reeves, I'm here. Try a manual heading correction, 2 degrees right. A pause. Then, corrections holding. Good. Don't trust the autopilot until you're on the ground and a ClearPath tech has gone through the system. Fly it in. Copy that. Another pause. Mercer. Eastern Command wants to know your status. Tell them the navigation system has been manually corrected and the aircraft is clear to proceed on its original routing. The modification has been isolated and preserved for forensic review. He looked at his phone. The destination coordinates were still in his mapping application, sitting there with the specificity of intent. Tell them I'm also flagging possible deliberate tampering for investigation. I'll provide the technical documentation to whoever they designate. Understood. One more pause. Nice work. Logan disconnected and sat in the avionics bay for a moment in the blue-white light and let himself breathe. Just breathe. Nothing dramatic, nothing he'd call a feeling, exactly. Just the particular exhale of a moment when the thing you were trying to stop has been stopped. His hands were steady. They were always steady when it mattered. It was the moments after that sometimes shook. He thought about Ellie eating vegetable soup at Mrs. Callahan's kitchen table, complaining about it with the specific theatrical suffering of a 13-year-old who was, at her core, absolutely fine. He pulled the diagnostic cable, closed the terminal, and went back into the cabin. The shift in the room was immediate and physical. The investors were still in their seats, but they were sitting differently. Less rigid, more the way people sit when the background threat has lowered a few degrees. One of them, not the silver-haired man, a younger one, maybe 45, with a name Logan hadn't caught, actually exhaled audibly when Logan came through the door. Victoria was standing near the forward bulkhead. She'd been talking to someone on her phone, and she ended the call when she saw him. Navigation is corrected, Logan said. Your captain is flying manually into New York. When you land, you'll need a ClearPath technician to do a full system restore before the aircraft flies again. She nodded. And the modification? Deliberate. Someone accessed the aircraft in the 48 hours before departure and altered the routing subroutine to force you into restricted military airspace. The destination coordinates were specific and intentional. He looked at her steadily. This wasn't a software glitch. The cabin was very quiet. Someone tried to destroy my defense contract, she said. It wasn't a question. That's what the coordinates suggest. The point you were being routed toward would have resulted in a military emergency response and a public incident that would have made the contract review board withdraw. My COO knew about the contract timeline. She said this quietly, not to Logan, almost to herself. The kind of statement that arrives with the weight of something you've been half knowing for a while and have finally let yourself finish knowing. He's the one who arranged the ClearPath service. He handles all the fleet maintenance authorizations. Logan said nothing. He wasn't an investigator. The coordinates were evidence. What she did with the implication was her business. Mr. Mercer? Her voice had changed again. Lower, stripped of the management register she'd been using. On the tarmac, You were under pressure and I was an obstacle, he said. Not angry, just accurate. I understand how that works. That doesn't excuse it. No, it doesn't. He let that sit. But we're not on the tarmac anymore. She looked at him with an expression that was hard to read. Not because it was complicated, but because it was honest, and honest expressions on people who have spent years behind professional surfaces have a slightly raw quality, like something recently uncovered. "Who are you?" she asked. Not the same question Cole had asked. Different stakes, different register. "Right now, I'm the mechanic who fixed your navigation system," Logan said. She almost smiled. It was the quick, involuntary kind, there and gone, like a fish breaking the surface. "Right now," she repeated. "The rest is a longer conversation." The silver-haired investor, Logan had decided he was the senior one, the one whose opinion the others calibrated from, cleared his throat. "Ms. Ashford, perhaps we should discuss the contract meeting. Given the circumstances, a delay might be appropriate." "The meeting is at 4 o'clock, Victoria said without looking at him. "We'll make it." The Air Force is aware of the situation and has cleared our routing. We'll make the meeting." Her voice had recovered its precision. Not the boardroom authority from the tarmac, something more settled than that. Something that had been tested in the last 2 hours and had come out the other side knowing something it didn't know before. "Gentlemen, I suggest we use the remaining flight time productively. There are materials in the document folders at each seat." Logan moved toward the rear of the cabin. He wanted a seat, a few minutes of quiet, and something to drink that wasn't the flight suit's water bottle he'd been rationing since Patuxent. Cole appeared beside him. "I verified your license," he said, low enough that it was just between them. "And?" "It's valid." A pause. "The clearance flag on your military record?" Another pause, longer this time. "I used to work counterterrorism. I've seen a lot of files. I've never seen a flag like that." He said it without inflection, just observation. "I owe you an apology for the avionics bay." "You were doing your job," Logan said. "I was wrong." "Both things can be true." Logan sat down in the rearmost seat, the one closest to the galley. Through the small oval window, the sky was still enormously, indifferently blue, unchanged by everything that had happened inside the aircraft. The same sky it had been when he'd watched the Gulf Stream lift off from Whitmore and known he had 40 minutes to do something that might not be enough. A flight attendant appeared and asked him, with the professional composure of someone who had clearly had a very unusual morning, whether he would like anything. "Water," Logan said. "Please." "Of course." She hesitated. Are we safe?" He looked at her. Mid-30s, dark eyes, the specific composed worry of someone who'd been keeping the fear at operational distance for the past hour and was starting to feel the cost of it. "Yes," he said. "You're safe." She nodded. Let out a breath. "Thank you." She went to get his water, and Logan leaned his head back against the seat and closed his eyes for a moment. Just a moment. Not sleeping. He didn't sleep easily, hadn't since the military, and certainly not on aircraft, but resting in the specific relief of a problem solved. The problem of how the sabotage had happened. What he didn't yet know, what was still waiting at the other end of this flight like a door he hadn't opened, was what would happen when they landed. He'd saved the aircraft. He'd saved 12 people. He still had to survive what came next. Victoria Ashford sat at the front of the cabin and looked at the document folder on her tray table without reading it. She was thinking about coordinates. She was thinking about a navigation system that someone inside her company had quietly broken, and about the fact that she had stood on a tarmac 3 hours ago and dismissed the one person who'd seen it coming. She was thinking about what that said about her, not the mistake itself, which was a mistake she could trace to pressure and arrogance, and the specific blindness of someone who had spent 3 years making every right call and had started to believe that instinct was the same as judgment. She was thinking about a man in a gray coverall who had said 12 people and meant it, and whom she had looked at and seen only an obstacle. She opened the document folder and looked at the numbers without reading them. The aircraft held its corrected course, steady and level, carrying them all forward through the blue October sky. Behind her, the quiet mechanic who had come after them anyway sat with his eyes closed and his water glass on the tray table, and his hands, when you looked at them, were completely still. They landed at Teterboro at 2:47 in the afternoon. Not LaGuardia, not JFK. Teterboro, the executive airport in New Jersey that existed specifically so that people with $40 million jets didn't have to share terminals with the general public. Logan had been to Teterboro once before, years ago, for reasons he'd never written down anywhere. He recognized the flat industrial geometry of the place, the low hangars, the corporate FBOs, the particular silence of an airport that processed wealth quietly and without ceremony. The landing was clean. Reeves put the aircraft down with the controlled competence of a man who'd been flying manually for the better part of an hour and wasn't going to let the last 30 seconds undo any of it. The passengers exhaled. Not dramatically, not all at once, but Logan felt it. The collective release of breath that a room holds when the wheels make contact with the earth and the earth holds. The aircraft rolled to a stop. For a moment, nobody moved. That happened sometimes, Logan had noticed, after something that should have been catastrophic but wasn't. People sat with the not catastrophe for a beat, not quite believing it yet, the way you stand in the doorway of a room you thought was on fire and just look at the ordinary furniture. Then the silver-haired investor said, "Well," and the moment broke, and people started gathering their things. Logan stayed in his seat while the cabin organized itself around him. Cole appeared at the forward door, coordinating with the ground crew outside. Victoria was on her phone again, speaking in the compressed, rapid sentences of someone rerouting a situation in real time. The investors gathered in a cluster near the exit with the bonded manner of men who had shared an unusual experience and were already deciding how to describe it. Logan looked out the window at the gray New Jersey sky. Clouds had moved in from the west while they were flying, the October blue gone, and thought about what came next. What came next was the part he hadn't planned for, which was most of it. He had fixed the navigation system. He had preserved the modification data for forensic review. He had told Eastern Command what he'd found. The chain of custody for that information was now in the hands of people better equipped to act on it than he was, and his role was, technically, complete. What he didn't have was a ride back to Richmond. What he didn't have was his van, his equipment, or any clothing that wasn't a borrowed flight suit. What he did have was his phone, his diagnostic tablet, a water glass with an Ashford Industries logo on it that he'd accidentally carried off the aircraft, and a daughter who was currently eating soup she didn't like at a neighbor's kitchen table and wondering when her father was coming home. He called Ellie first. "Dad?" She picked up on the first ring, which meant she'd been holding the phone. She was 13 and tried very hard not to be obvious about worrying, and was not very successful at it, which Logan found both painful and quietly wonderful. "Where are you?" "New Jersey." "Why are you in New Jersey?" "Long story. I'll tell you when I get home." "When is that?" "Tonight. Late, probably. You okay with Mrs. Callahan for dinner?" "She's making the soup again." A pause. "Dad, you sound weird." "I'm fine." "You always say that." "Because I'm always fine." "You're not always fine. Sometimes you're fine and just not telling me about the part that isn't." He was quiet for a moment. 13 years old, and she could do that. Cut straight to the place where the actual truth lived, with the instinctive accuracy of someone who had learned early to read the space around her father's words for what wasn't being said. He didn't know where she'd gotten that. Her mother had been direct too, but in a different way. Forward, declarative. Ellie's directness came from somewhere quieter. "I'm okay," he said. Genuinely. "Today was complicated, but I'm okay." "Complicated how?" "Soup," he said. "Eat it." She made a sound that was mostly exasperation, and partly, if you listened carefully, relief. "Fine. I'll be home by 10. Don't stay up." "I'll stay up until 9:59. "I know," he said. He ended the call and sat with the phone in his hand for a moment. Then he got up, because sitting wasn't going to solve any of the things that still needed solving. The FBO terminal at Teterboro had the atmosphere of a very expensive waiting room. Leather chairs, recessed lighting, the kind of architectural restraint that signals money by refusing to announce it. Logan walked through it in his borrowed flight suit and felt the brief, sliding attention of the staff. Not hostile, just categorizing. He was an anomaly in a space designed for people who arrived in categories. He was trying to figure out how to arrange transportation back to Richmond when Victoria found him. She'd changed, or started to. The blazer was gone. She was carrying it over one arm, and her hair, which had been perfect on the tarmac at Whitmore, had acquired the slight disorganization of a very long morning. She looked, Logan thought, more like a person than she had in Richmond, more dimensional. He wasn't sure if that was the day, or the altitude, or just what happened when you spent 2 hours on an aircraft that someone had tried to use to destroy you. I need to speak with you, she said. I assumed. She looked around the terminal. Cole was near the entrance, on his phone, keeping his eyes moving the way security people kept their eyes moving. The investors had dispersed, cars waiting, separate agendas, the contract meeting apparently rescheduled for the following morning. Not here, she said. There's a conference room. The conference room had the same restrained aesthetic as the rest of the terminal. A table, chairs, a window overlooking the apron where the Gulfstream sat with its door still open, and a Teterboro ground crew standing around it waiting for instructions. Logan sat down. Victoria didn't. She stood near the window and looked at the aircraft for a moment before turning around. The modification, she said. You said the destination coordinates were specific. Yes? Where exactly? He showed her his phone, the mapping application with the coordinates marked. She looked at it for a long moment. That's the center of an active military flight corridor, she said. 2 of them, intersecting. Someone who knew military airspace. She handed the phone back. My COO, Richard Calloway, has a military aviation background. Navy, I think. He was an officer. He left the service about 6 years ago. She said this with the careful delivery of someone providing information rather than making an accusation, the way you learn to talk when you're not entirely sure where the ground is. He's also the person who recommended ClearPath for our fleet service contract. And he authorized the specific ClearPath work order for this aircraft? He approves all fleet maintenance above a certain dollar threshold. She crossed her arms, not defensively, more like she was holding something in place. The defense contract. Richard was the one who brought it to the board. He spent 8 months developing the relationship with the contract review committee. When I pushed for a more aggressive timeline on the final proposal, he pushed back. We disagreed, openly, in front of the board. She paused. Billionaire CEO and COO disagree over contract strategy. It's not unusual. Except most disagreements don't end with someone sabotaging the CEO's aircraft. No, she said quietly. They don't. Logan thought about the sophistication of the modification, the buried subroutine, the mimicked legitimate code, the specific destination in military airspace. Someone had planned this carefully and had the technical knowledge to execute it without leaving obvious traces. An ex-Navy officer with aviation background and full access to the fleet maintenance authorization system was a credible candidate. But Logan had learned a long time ago that credible candidates were exactly what you examined most carefully before you committed to them, because sometimes the credible candidate was exactly right, and sometimes they were what someone wanted you to see. Who else had access to the fleet maintenance system? He asked. She thought, Richard, obviously, our fleet manager, Donna Park, the ClearPath technicians during authorized service, and she stopped. And? Our IT security director, Garrett Fenn. He manages system access credentials across the company, including the maintenance authorization platforms. She said this more slowly. Richard and Garrett are close. They came to the company around the same time, about 4 years ago. From where? Different backgrounds. Richard from the Navy, Garrett from a private defense contractor. She looked at Logan. That's 2 people with defense sector backgrounds who are professionally close and were both in a position to access the fleet system. You should tell this to whoever Eastern Command sends to debrief you. I know. She didn't move from the window. Mr. Mercer, what I said on the tarmac, the way I spoke to you. We covered this on the aircraft. No, I started to, and you told me to wait, and then we landed, and now I'm finishing it. She said this with a firmness that wasn't aggressive, but wasn't negotiable either. I dismissed you. Not just professionally, not just as an inconvenience. I dismissed you as a person, in front of other people, in a way designed to make you smaller so that my decision to override you would seem more reasonable. She held his gaze. I'm aware of what I did. Logan was quiet for a moment. He'd been dismissed before, plenty of times, in plenty of registers, for plenty of reasons. He'd learned that the people who dismissed you were usually not aware they were doing it, which made later accountability rare. She was aware. That was different. I've been doing this job for 3 years, he said. Most of the time when I flag something and get overruled, the thing I flagged turns out to be fine. Clerical error, minor inconsistency, nothing that would have caused a problem. This time was different, but you had no way of knowing it would be different. That's very generous. It's accurate. He looked at her directly. What you did was wrong. The way you handled it was wrong. You also made a decision under pressure with incomplete information, which is something everyone does. The fact that the incomplete information happened to be hiding a deliberate act of sabotage is unusual. I still should have listened. Yes, he said. You should have. She nodded, accepted it, didn't deflect or soften it. He noticed that. The federal agents arrived 40 minutes later. Two of them, not Air Force, which Logan had expected, but from a Federal Aviation Security Division he recognized by their credentials even before they showed them. The senior agent was a woman named Carver, early 40s, compact, with the unhurried manner of someone who was already several steps into this situation before she walked into the room. The second was a man named Okafor, younger, who took notes on a physical notepad, which Logan appreciated because it meant the notes weren't immediately in a cloud somewhere. Carver looked at Logan the way professionals look at other professionals when they've been briefed but want to form their own opinion. Mr. Mercer, we've reviewed the diagnostic data you transferred to Eastern Command. And it's consistent with deliberate tampering. You preserved the modification intact, which is not what most people would have known to do. She said it without warmth, but also without the quality that sometimes came with federal acknowledgement. That slightly grudging quality of someone giving credit they'd rather not give. This was just assessment. Your former designation was flagged in the Eastern Command channel. I'd like to understand your current role. Aircraft mechanic, licensed A and P, contracted by Meridian Aviation Insurance for pre-departure inspections. Former role. Former is former. Mr. Mercer, I can give you my service record contact if you need to verify my clearance for the purposes of this investigation, he said. But my history isn't part of the evidence. The modification data is. The destination coordinates are. That's what you're here for. Carver looked at him for a moment, recalibrating. Then she moved on, which was what good agents did when they hit a wall. They noted it and went around. Walk me through what you found and when. He walked her through it. All of it. The initial flag on the certification code at Whitmore, the diagnostic check that revealed the post-installation modification, the call to Hendricks, the intercept, the avionics bay. Carver listened without interrupting. Okafor wrote steadily. Victoria sat at the end of the table and listened to Logan describe what had nearly happened to her aircraft with the expression of someone watching a version of events they'd been inside but couldn't fully see from where they were standing. When he finished, Carver looked at her notes. The destination coordinates are significant. The Hawthorne intersection hasn't been publicly listed in any civilian database for 6 months. It was reclassified as a restricted coordinate in April. Someone with access to current military airspace data chose that specific point. She looked up. That narrows the possible sources considerably. Richard Calloway, Victoria said, and potentially Garrett Fenn. Carver didn't react to the names, which meant she'd already heard them, or she was very good at not reacting. Probably both. We'll need access to Ashford Industries' fleet maintenance authorization records, IT access logs, and any communication records involving both individuals from the past 6 months. You'll have everything, Victoria said. We'll also need to speak with the ClearPath technician who performed the original update. Carver closed her folder. Miss Ashford, I'd like to ask you to delay notifying your COO or your IT security director of this investigation until we've had a chance to secure their access credentials and communication records. If either individual becomes aware of federal interest before we've contained the evidence, they'll destroy it, Victoria said. Yes. I understand. Victoria looked at her hands on the table. I have a board meeting at 9 a.m. tomorrow. Richard Calloway will be in that meeting. We'll be ready before 9 a.m., Carver said, with a flatness that suggested the timeline was not a request. Logan was in the process of making his exit, quietly, without announcement, the way he'd entered most rooms for the past 4 years, when Carver caught him in the terminal corridor. Mercer. She fell into step beside him. Off the record. Okay. The classified flag on your file. I've seen a lot of flags. Yours is from a category I've only seen 3 times in 12 years. She said it carefully, the way people spoke about things they weren't supposed to know they knew. The category relates to high-risk asset protection operations in active military environments. Logan kept walking. The kind of operation that puts someone on a list that makes career FAA. Inspectors go quiet on a radio channel, Carver said. If you have questions about my service record, the contact I provided, I'm not asking about your service record. She stopped walking, and because she stopped, he stopped. I'm telling you that I know what that flag means. And I'm telling you that what you did today, both the way you preserved the evidence, the way you isolated the subroutine without corrupting the modification data, the way you coordinated the intercept, that's not aircraft mechanic training. That's something else. Logan looked at her. I'm an aircraft mechanic, he said. That's what I'm licensed for. That's what I do. Okay. She held his gaze for a moment. Whoever you used to be, you did good work today. She handed him a card. If anything else surfaces, anything you remember, anything in the diagnostic data you didn't mention, call that number. He took the card. You'll want to look at the IT access logs from 48 hours before departure, he said, specifically after midnight. That's when the modification was made. Anyone who accessed the fleet maintenance system in that window and doesn't have a documented reason to be in it at 2 in the morning, that's your person. Carver looked at him. That's a very specific observation. The modification timestamp was 2:14 a.m. I found it during the ground inspection. It's in the diagnostic report. He put the card in his pocket. Good luck. He walked out into the gray New Jersey afternoon, and the door closed behind him, and the terminal swallowed the case and the agents and the Ashford Industries conference room and whatever was going to happen at 9 a.m. tomorrow. Logan stood on the curb outside the Teterboro FBO and called Marcus. You're alive, Marcus said. Yeah. Are you in New York? New Jersey, Teterboro. A cab was pulling up. Not for him, for someone else. A man in a suit who came through the terminal doors and got in without looking at Logan. Logan watched it pull away. Can you pick me up? Logan, I am in Richmond in our van. I have been in our van since you climbed onto a military aircraft and flew away from me on a runway. Right. What do you want me to do? Stay there. I'll arrange something. He thought for a moment. Marcus, the diagnostic report we filed with Meridian. I need you to make sure it's flagged as a formal tampering report, not just a certification discrepancy. The federal investigation will want the original filing. I already did, Marcus said. About 20 minutes after you flew away. I'm not an idiot. I know you're not. I also want to say, for the record, that I've worked with you for 3 years, and this is the most unusual day I've had in 22 years of aviation inspection, and I think you have some things to explain to me. I know. Not today. I can tell today is not the day. I'll buy you a beer, Logan said. You'll buy me several beers, Marcus said, and hung up. What's up? Victoria found him on the curb 20 minutes later. She'd reorganized, blazer back on, phone in hand, the professional surface reassembled with the efficiency of someone who had been putting themselves back together after difficult moments for long enough that it didn't take long anymore. Cole was with her, 10 feet back, giving them space he'd apparently decided they needed. Where are you going? She asked. Richmond, eventually. We have a car. I can have it take you anywhere. I'm fine. Mr. Mercer. She said it with the quality of someone who was choosing to try again, which he recognized as an act of effort for her. You came after us. You got on a military aircraft and flew after a jet full of people who had dismissed you to fix a problem that legally had nothing to do with you anymore. She looked at him directly. The least I can do is make sure you get home. He thought about Ellie saying, I'll stay up until 9:59. Richmond, he said. Done. She spoke to Cole, who made a brief call. Then she looked back at Logan. The meeting tomorrow, the defense contract review. Assuming the investigation, she paused. Assuming everything is still standing tomorrow morning, the contract committee is going to want to know what happened. You'll tell them. I'll tell them part of it, the part I can tell them. She looked at the gray sky above the Teterboro hangars. The part where a man told me something was wrong and I didn't listen, and it nearly destroyed everything. That part, I'll probably keep to myself, at least initially. Logan said nothing. That's honest, not admirable, she said. I'm not telling you it's admirable. I know. I'll get there. The admirable version. It just might take me a minute. He almost said something, then didn't. She wasn't asking for reassurance. She was just being accurate about herself in a way that was harder than it sounded, and he recognized the effort in it. The car arrived. Black SUV, different from the ones at Whitmore. A Teterboro vehicle, hired. The driver opened the door without being asked. Logan got in. Victoria stood at the door. Your daughter, she said. She knows what you do for a living? He looked at her. He hadn't mentioned Ellie to anyone today except Ellie herself. She knows I inspect aircraft. That's what you do for a living, Victoria said. Is it what you are? It was a sharper question than he expected from her, and the fact that it was sharp made him reconsider his read of her. Or not reconsider exactly, but expand it. She was reading him the way he'd been reading her all day, and she was better at it than he'd given her credit for. No, he said. It's not what I am. She nodded. Then she probably knows more than you think. She closed the door. The car pulled away from the curb, and Logan watched the Teterboro terminal recede in the rear window. And then he turned forward and looked at the New Jersey highway and thought about a 13-year-old girl who had said, "You sound weird," and meant, "I know something happened, and I'm scared, but I'm not going to say that out loud." She probably knows more than you think. He leaned his head back against the seat. The car drove south through the gray afternoon, and somewhere behind him in the city, federal agents were pulling access logs for a fleet maintenance system, and a man named Richard Calloway was going about his Tuesday without knowing that the thing he'd built to destroy his CEO had failed, and that the failure had been witnessed, documented, and handed to people whose job was to find exactly what he'd done. Logan closed his eyes. Not sleeping, just sitting with the weight of the day as it shifted from event into memory, not clean, not fully processed, carrying all the jagged edges that events carried before time got to them. He thought about the tarmac at Whitmore, about the moment the Gulfstream's gear had retracted and the aircraft had gone bright in the October sun, and he'd stood there knowing what was on board and not having stopped it. He thought about 12 people. He thought about the fact that all 12 of them would eat dinner tonight and sleep in their beds and wake up tomorrow without knowing how close the margin had been, not because they were careless, but because the margin was always there, the gap between the thing that happened and the thing that almost happened, and most people never had to see it up close. Logan had spent most of his life standing at that gap. He'd spent the last 4 years trying to stand a little further from it. Today it had found him anyway, the way the things you walk away from sometimes do, not because you were looking for them, but because they recognize something in you that you can't quite put away, even when you try. The car drove on. The gray sky held. Richmond was 3 hours south. He got home at 9:43. Ellie was on the couch with a textbook open on her lap and the television on low, which was her version of not waiting up. She looked up when he came through the door and did the thing she always did, a quick, full-length assessment, the way someone checks a returned item for damage. Logan had never pointed this out to her because he didn't want her to stop doing it. It meant she was paying attention, and paying attention was a skill he respected. "You look tired," she said. "I am tired. And you're wearing someone else's clothes." He looked down at the flight suit he'd never had a chance to change out of. Vasquez's name was stenciled on the left chest. "It's a long story." "You keep saying that." "Because it keeps being true." He sat down on the other end of the couch. The television was showing a nature documentary, something about deep ocean geology, the kind of program Ellie watched when she was too tired to choose something she actually wanted to watch. "How was the soup?" "Terrible. I ate all of it." "That's my girl?" She closed the textbook. She was studying something with a lot of diagrams. Engineering, probably. Ellie had been interested in how things worked since she was old enough to take apart a kitchen timer and put it back together mostly correctly. She got that from somewhere Logan didn't examine too carefully, because examining it meant thinking about the person she got it from, and that was a weight he rationed. "Dad," she said, "what actually happened today?" "I flagged a problem on an aircraft. The problem turned out to be more serious than the documentation indicated. I had to go deal with it." "You flew to New Jersey?" "Yes." "In a military plane?" He looked at her. "How do you know that?" She held up her phone. On the screen was a brief news item from an aviation industry feed. the kind of niche publication that tracked FAA activity and military airspace incidents. The headline said, "Civilian Gulfstream Intercept over Maryland, Federal Investigation Underway." The article didn't mention his name. It mentioned an unnamed aviation specialist who had coordinated the emergency navigation override. "I follow aviation news," Ellie said with the precise neutrality of someone who has prepared this explanation. "For school." "You follow aviation news for school?" "Engineering applications, systems thinking." She lowered the phone. "Was anyone hurt?" "No." "Was it close?" He thought about the destination coordinates on his mapping application, about the Hawthorne intersection and what a civilian aircraft in the middle of it would have meant for the 12 people aboard and for the military operations in the corridor. "It was close enough," he said. Ellie was quiet for a moment. The documentary showed something moving slowly across the ocean floor, a deep-sea crawler of some kind, probing the dark with mechanical arms. "The unnamed aviation specialist," she said. "Go to bed, Bug." "Dad." "Ellie." She looked at him for a long moment with the particular quality of look she'd developed over the past year. Not a child's look, not yet fully an adult's, but something in between that was more unsettling than either because it saw clearly without having the vocabulary yet to frame what it saw. "You're going to tell me someday," she said, "about all of it, the stuff you don't talk about. Someday. Not tonight." "Not tonight." She nodded. She accepted this the way she accepted most things about him. Not happily, not without registering that she wasn't happy, but without making it a fight. She got up from the couch, and when she passed him, she put her hand briefly on his shoulder. Just for a second, a light, factual contact, the kind you make when words would be too much. And then she went down the hall to her room. Logan sat on the couch alone and listened to the documentary and didn't move for a long time. The call came at 7:15 the following morning. He was in the kitchen, standing at the counter with a cup of coffee that had gone slightly cold because he'd forgotten to drink it while he was looking at the news on his phone. The aviation feed had more coverage now. The Ashford Industries story had moved from industry publications to general news overnight. The framing was still tentative, the kind of reporting that had information but not all the information, and was being careful about what it asserted. Federal agents investigate alleged navigation tampering on Ashford Industries, private jet. CEO Victoria Ashford. Unavailable for comment. Company stock down 4.2% in pre-market trading. He was reading that when his phone lit up with a number he didn't recognize. "Mercer," he said. "Mr. Mercer." A man's voice, controlled, precise, with the synthetic warmth of someone who had learned to sound reasonable as a professional skill. "My name is Daniel Howell. I'm the Senior Communications Director for Ashford Industries. I'm reaching out on behalf of the company." Logan waited. "We wanted to connect with you before the media coverage develops further," Howell said. "As you may be aware, there's some public interest in yesterday's incident, and we're working to shape a coherent narrative around it. We'd appreciate the opportunity to speak with you about how you're describing your involvement." Shape a coherent narrative. Logan recognized that phrase. It was the kind of phrase that meant something specific, and what it meant was, "We would like to control what you say." "I've already given a full account to federal investigators," Logan said. "That account is the accurate one." "Of course. We're not asking you to deviate from accuracy. We're simply hoping to coordinate messaging so that the story that reaches the public—" "Mr. Howell, I'm not going to coordinate messaging with you." A brief pause. "Mr. Mercer, Ashford Industries is in a delicate position with regard to the defense contract. Then Ashford Industries should talk to its federal investigators and its legal team, not to me." He picked up his coffee. It was definitely cold now. "Is there something else?" Another pause, longer. When Howell spoke again, the synthetic warmth was slightly thinner, like a coat worn one season too long. "We would prefer that your public characterization of Ms. Ashford's decision-making on the tarmac be measured." There it was. "Ms. Ashford made a business decision based on incomplete information," Logan said. "That's accurate, and I'll say it if asked. What I won't do is adjust my account of what I found, what I reported, and what the response was, Because those facts are part of a federal investigation, and I'm not in the business of managing them for someone else's benefit. I see. A flat, professional beat. Thank you for your time. The call ended. Logan looked at his cold coffee and thought about the fact that someone at Ashford Industries had decided the correct response to a federal investigation was to call the man who had provided the primary evidence and suggest he think carefully about his messaging. He thought about what that suggested about how the company operated beneath the level of its CEO, the layers of management beneath Victoria Ashford that had their own interests and their own calculations and their own ideas about what the story should be. He poured the coffee out and made a fresh cup. Carver called at 9:05. "We have Calloway," she said. Not hello, not good morning, just the information. "What did you find?" The IT access log put Garrett Fenn in the fleet maintenance system at 2:11 a.m., 3 days before departure. His credentials, his access point, an office in Ashford Industries headquarters in McLean. The modification timestamp from your diagnostic report is 2:14 a.m., 3 minutes. She said this with the satisfaction of someone who had spent the night connecting things that were meant to stay disconnected. Fenn and Calloway were communicating through an encrypted messaging application on personal devices. We're still working through the content, but what we have so far suggests the plan was Calloway's and Fenn executed the technical side. Calloway knew the military airspace. Yes, his Navy record shows an operations specialty in restricted airspace coordination. He knew the Hawthorne intersection because he'd flown military assignments that used it. A pause. He also had a $12 million short position on Ashford Industries stock through a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands. If the defense contract fell through in a public catastrophic way, that position was worth considerably more. Logan absorbed that. The full architecture of it, not just destroy the contract but profit from the destruction. Calloway had built a mechanism that would eliminate his CEO, collapse the stock in a single dramatic event, and turn his short position into a windfall. All of it riding on a routing subroutine that nobody was supposed to find. He almost got away with it, Logan said. He would have, Carver said, if you hadn't been looking at the right thing at the right time. A pause. Fenn is cooperating. He's been cooperating since about 2 this morning. Apparently, Calloway told him the modification was a test of the aircraft's emergency response capabilities, a planned drill that had been authorized by the CEO's office. Fenn didn't know anyone was actually going to be on the aircraft. He believed that? He wanted to believe it. There's a difference. Carver's voice was dry. People make decisions about what they're willing to know. Fenn decided he was willing to not ask certain questions because Calloway was his mentor and his friend, and the alternative was knowing something he didn't want to know. Logan thought about that, about the specific human machinery of it, how you could participate in something terrible by carefully limiting the questions you asked. It wasn't stupidity. It was a kind of moral cowardice that dressed itself as loyalty. What happens to him? Logan asked. That's for the prosecutors. I'd imagine cooperating early helps him. A pause. Mercer. There's something else. He waited. Calloway's legal team filed a preliminary response this morning. They're contesting the timeline and the chain of evidence. They're also, she said this carefully, questioning whether your access to the aircraft's avionics system was authorized and whether any evidence you extracted is admissible given the circumstances of your boarding. Logan was quiet. I want to be clear that I believe the evidence is solid, Carver said. Your access was authorized by the aircraft's captain, who has full operational authority over the aircraft while in flight. Calloway's team knows this. What they're doing is creating noise, trying to muddy the water enough that the investigation gets complicated. They're going to push on your background, on why someone with classified military credentials was working as an insurance inspector, on whether your presence on that aircraft was in some way coordinated in advance. It wasn't coordinated. I had a diagnostic cable and a phone. That's what I had. I know that. The log supports it. But Calloway's team is going to build a narrative where you're not a mechanic who happened to find something. They're going to try to make you someone who was already involved in the situation. She paused. You should expect your name to be public by tomorrow, and not in the way you'd want. It was in the news by 4 that afternoon. Not his service record, that was sealed and would stay sealed, but his name and the connection between his name and the investigation and a version of the morning at Whitmore that had been filtered through someone at Ashford Industries who was not Daniel Howell, but who had similar interests. The version that emerged wasn't entirely false. It just emphasized certain things and left out others in a way that produced a shape he didn't recognize. Inspector Who flagged Ashford jet linked to classified military file. Investigators probe possible advance knowledge of sabotage. He read the headline from his phone, sitting in the parking lot of Ellie's school because he'd arrived 15 minutes early without meaning to and hadn't wanted to drive around the block 3 times. The story quoted an unnamed source close to the Ashford Industries legal team, who suggested that the rapid identification of the navigation modification and the speed of the Federal intercept response raised questions about whether the situation had been staged. Logan set the phone face down on the passenger seat. He thought about what Carver had said, about noise, and about the way evidence got complicated when the people with the most to lose started throwing things at it. He'd seen this before, not in aviation, but in other rooms, in other contexts, in the part of his life that didn't appear in his public record. He knew what it looked like when people started building alternate versions of events. He knew how long it took to dismantle them. He also knew that he was sitting in a parking lot outside a middle school and that in approximately 4 minutes, his daughter was going to walk through those doors, and that whatever was about to happen to his name in the next several days was going to be something she would see. That was the part that landed with actual weight. Not the investigation, not Calloway's legal team, not unnamed sources. Ellie. He picked the phone back up and called Marcus.
"I've seen it," Marcus said without waiting for Logan to speak. "Meridian is going to want a statement. Meridian's legal department called me 40 minutes ago. They want us both in their office tomorrow morning." A pause. "Logan, they used the word exposure. What kind?" "The kind where they're worried about being associated with someone whose name is in a federal investigation story, even as a witness, even as the person who found the thing."
Marcus's voice had a tightness in it that Logan recognized as anger being held at careful distance. "It's not right. No, it isn't." "What are you going to do?" Logan watched the school doors, still closed. He had maybe 2 minutes. "I'm going to go in tomorrow and give them a clear account of what happened and make sure our original report is on record. After that," he stopped. "After that, I don't know yet. The media story is going to get worse before it gets better. I know. Your name is going to be in it. I know that too." "Logan?" Marcus stopped, tried again. "What do you need?" It was a simple question, the kind Marcus asked when he'd run out of logistics and was left with just the person in front of him. Logan didn't get asked that question often. He'd organized his life in a way that minimized the occasions when someone could usefully ask it, contained, self-sufficient, the architecture of a man who had decided that needing things from people was a variable he could manage down to near zero. "I need the documentation clean," Logan said. "Every timestamp, every file transfer, every call log from yesterday. I need it all preserved and organized so that when someone tries to build a story about what happened, the record tells the accurate version without me having to argue for it." "I can do that," Marcus said. "I already started." "Thank you." The school doors opened. Students began moving through them in the particular organized disorder of end-of-day release, backpacks, phone screens, the loud transactional sociability of early adolescence. Logan watched for Ellie. He found her before she found him. She was talking to another girl, laughing at something, the laugh unguarded and uncalculated, the kind kids have before they learn to manage them. She had her mother's laugh. She didn't know that because she'd been 3 when her mother died, and she had no memory of the sound. But Logan knew it, and sometimes it arrived like this, unexpected, in a school parking lot in October, and he just had to sit with it. She spotted the car and said something to the other girl and came across the lot. She got in and put her backpack on the floor and said, "There's a thing about you online." "I know. The headline is wrong. Headlines often are. It says you might have known about the sabotage in advance." She was looking at her phone, reading, her face doing the thing it did when she was processing something and hadn't decided how to feel about it yet. "Did you?" "No." "So they're wrong." "Yes." She put the phone in her pocket. "Okay," she said. He looked at her. "Okay?" "You said no. You don't lie to me. She looked back at him with the clear, settled certainty of someone who had decided something a long time ago and hadn't seen a reason to revise it. So they're wrong, and it'll get fixed. Logan looked at his daughter. At the absolute, unqualified confidence in him that she carried like it cost her nothing. Because to her, it didn't. It was just a fact. The way gravity was a fact. The way the sequence of engineering steps was a fact. You didn't question facts. You worked from them. He didn't say what he wanted to say, which was that he hoped she was right and that the evidence supported her confidence, but that the world didn't always resolve in the direction of accuracy, no matter how clear the record was. He didn't say that because she was 13 and she already knew that, and she was choosing to believe in him anyway, and that choice deserved respect rather than immediate qualification. "Put your seatbelt on," he said. Boom. The Meridian meeting the next morning lasted 2 hours and was exactly what Logan had expected. A room full of cautious people with liability concerns trying to find the cleanest distance between themselves and an ongoing federal investigation. The legal team had 3 questions that they asked in 17 different configurations. Had Logan acted outside his authorized scope? Had he created additional risk for Meridian? And was there any scenario in which Meridian's pre-departure inspection report could be characterized as part of the problem rather than part of the solution? Logan answered the same way each time. His scope had been pre-departure inspection. He had found a discrepancy and reported it. When the aircraft departed against his recommendation, he had taken personal action using resources entirely outside his professional capacity and entirely outside Meridian's liability. The federal investigation would confirm that his actions had prevented a significantly worse outcome. The pre-departure report was a clean document that said exactly what it needed to say. The legal team didn't like the clarity. Clarity was harder to manage than ambiguity. But the record was what it was. And after 2 hours, they arrived at the conclusion that the best position for Meridian was to stand behind the report and let the investigation run its course. Marcus walked out with Logan afterward and said, "Well, that was fun." "It was fine. They were looking for a reason to cut you loose." "I know. They didn't find one." Logan stopped at the parking lot edge. The October sky was back. The same clean blue as the morning at Whitmore, indifferent and enormous. "Marcus, thank you for the documentation." "Of course. And for not asking me to explain myself." Marcus looked at him with the expression he wore when he was deciding whether to say the thing he was thinking. He usually decided to say it. "You don't have to explain yourself. What you did was right. What you did on that aircraft was—" He stopped, started again. "I've been doing this for 22 years. I've never been close to something like that. And I know that for you it was just Tuesday." "It wasn't just Tuesday." "No, I know it wasn't." Marcus put his hands in his pockets. "Whatever your history is, Logan, the parts you don't talk about. I'm not asking. I just want you to know that I've watched you work for 3 years and I know what kind of person you are. Whatever the headlines say." Logan nodded. He wasn't good at receiving that kind of thing. Never had been. He stood with it for a moment, the way you stand with something that has real weight and isn't going anywhere. "Beer," Logan said. "I owe you several." "Yes, you do," Marcus said. "Call me when this is over." It was Carver who called 3 days later with the thing that changed the shape of everything. "Callaway's attorney subpoenaed your original inspection report," she said. "Both the pre-departure filing and the ground diagnostic data. They're building an argument that the modification in the NavCom system wasn't what you identified it as, that what you found was a legitimate system update that was incorrectly characterized as malicious due to your interpretation of the data." "That's not what the data shows." "I know that. The ClearPath manufacturer's engineer who reviewed your diagnostic agrees with you completely. The modification was outside any legitimate update parameter. But Callaway's team hired their own avionics expert, who's going to testify that the distinction between a legitimate post-installation adjustment and a malicious modification is, in his opinion, a matter of interpretation." Logan stood in his kitchen and looked out the window at the small backyard, a square of grass, a tool shed he'd built the summer after they moved in, an apple tree that had produced 3 apples this year and dropped 2 of them on his car. That's not a credible position. It doesn't have to be credible. It has to be complicated enough to introduce doubt. If a jury hears 2 aviation experts disagree about what the data means,
Calloway's team gets to argue that the whole investigation was built on an ambiguous foundation. She paused. They're also filing a motion to unseal your military record. They want to argue that your classified background gives you interpretive tools that a civilian court shouldn't take on faith. My record will not be unsealed. The motion will be denied, but the filing itself is already in the press.
Another pause, shorter. Mercer, I need you to come in, not as a witness, as a technical consultant for the prosecution. I need you to sit across from their avionics expert and make the data irrefutable. Logan looked at the apple tree. One apple left. It had been there for 2 weeks, hanging on with the specific stubbornness of things that don't know they're supposed to fall yet. If I do that, he said, my name is in this until it's over. Yes, and whatever their expert says about my background, whatever story they're building around the data, I have to sit in that room and let them build it. Yes, Carver's voice was level. Logan, I'm going to tell you something that I probably shouldn't. The short position that Calloway held, the $12 million. We found evidence that 3 other Ashford Industries executives had similar positions. Smaller, but structured the same way. This wasn't just Calloway. There's a network of people inside that company who were prepared to profit from an aircraft going down. The weight of that settled over him slowly. Not $12 million and a ruined contract. A network of people who had looked at 12 human lives and decided they were an acceptable cost for a profitable outcome. They would have let all of them die, Logan said. Yes. He closed his eyes briefly, opened them. The apple was still there. Tell me when and where, he said. He told Ellie that night. Not everything. Not Carver's call, not the network of executives, not the full scope of what Calloway had built. But he told her that his name was going to be in the investigation for longer than he'd hoped, and that there were people who were going to say things about him that weren't true, and that the process of correcting those things was going to take a while. She listened. She didn't ask questions until he was done, which was another thing she'd developed that impressed him. The patience to let information arrive before she decided what to do with it. Does it scare you? She asked. He thought about that honestly. Parts of it. Which parts? The parts I can't control. The parts where someone else decides what the story is. He looked at her. I've spent a lot of years making sure I control my own story. This is a situation where I don't. That's uncomfortable. You controlled the aircraft, she said. That's different. That was a technical problem. So is this. She tilted her head slightly, the way she did when she was working something out. It's a different kind of system. Information instead of code. You figure out where the bad data was inserted, you trace it back, you correct it. Same process. He looked at his daughter. 13 years old, in the same house he'd been renting for 4 years, in the same kitchen where she'd eaten cereal every morning and complained about homework and grown 3 inches without warning, and she was sitting here applying systems thinking to the problem of her father's reputation with the calm clarity of someone who trusted the underlying architecture. You're going to be an engineer, he said. I know, she said. Good, he said. She went to do her homework. Logan sat in the kitchen and looked at the table and thought about systems, about the navigation subroutine that had been inserted into a working architecture, about the network of people inside a company who had built a mechanism for profit inside a structure designed for something else, about the way corruption worked when it was careful. When it dressed itself in the language of the system, it was subverting. And he thought about what it took to correct it, not just the technical work, the staying, the sitting in rooms where people said wrong things about you and waiting for the record to assert itself, the willingness to be in the story even when the story was uncomfortable, because the alternative was letting someone else write the ending. He'd been quiet for 4 years. He'd chosen a life of careful invisibility, of work that was clean and bounded, and asked nothing of the person underneath the license number. Today asked something different. He was still deciding, in the part of himself where decisions actually lived, whether he was ready to give it. But he already knew the answer. He'd known it on a tarmac in Richmond when a $40 million jet had lifted into the October sky and taken 12 people with it. He'd known it then, and he knew it now, and the knowing hadn't changed. The federal hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday in November, 6 weeks after the aircraft had landed at Teterboro. 6 weeks was long enough for the story to go through several versions in the press. the initial incident report, the arrest of Richard Calloway and Garrett Fenn, the disclosure of the short-selling network, and finally the slower, more complicated coverage that followed when the full scope of what had been built inside Ashford Industries began to surface. 3 other executives besides Calloway and Fenn, a shell company structure that ran through 4 countries, a scheme that had been in development for almost 18 months, built patiently, quietly, inside the architecture of a company that manufactured aerospace components and sold them to the United States government. Logan read most of it and said very little publicly. He gave one interview to a federal aviation safety publication that he trusted to be accurate, and in it he said only what he could support with the record. He didn't describe Victoria Ashford's decision on the tarmac as reckless. He described it as a decision made under pressure with incomplete information, which was what it was, and he declined to expand on that when the interviewer pushed. What he didn't say, and what the publication couldn't print because it existed only in the diagnostic data and in the federal investigation file, was that the modification Fenn had installed was one of the cleanest pieces of malicious avionics code he had ever seen. In another life, the life he didn't talk about, he had seen deliberate system compromises that were messy, obvious, the work of people who understood the goal but not the architecture. Fenn's work was different. It was the work of someone who understood both. The fact that Logan had found it at all was partly skill and partly the specific accident of being the person who happened to pull the right log at the right moment and have enough background to recognize what the timestamp comparison meant. He thought about that sometimes, in the weeks before the hearing, about how close the margin was, about the version of that morning in which Marcus had said, "Let's just file the report and go," and Logan had agreed, and the Gulfstream had taken off and made it 43 minutes before the drift became undeniable, and by then the military response would have been the story, not the sabotage, and 12 people would have been caught in the middle of something they didn't cause and couldn't control. He thought about it, and he tried not to think about it too much, because thinking about the near misses too carefully was the kind of thing that made a certain type of person stop being able to function. And Logan had learned a long time ago that functioning was the only thing that actually helped anyone. The hearing was in a federal building in Washington. Not a courtroom, not yet, though the criminal proceedings against Calloway and the others were in process and would eventually get there. This was an aviation safety hearing, convened by a federal panel to establish the factual record around the incident and make recommendations for regulatory changes. Logan had been called as a technical witness. He wore a suit. He hadn't worn a suit in 4 years, not since the last formal occasion that required one, which had been something he didn't think about in November if he could help it. The suit still fit, more or less, though the shoulders were slightly tight in a way that reminded him he'd been doing more physical work in the past 4 years than the suit had anticipated. Ellie had looked at him that morning in the kitchen with an expression that was trying to conceal being impressed and failing. "You clean up okay," she said. "Thank you." "You look nervous." "I'm not nervous." "You made coffee twice." He had, in fact, made coffee twice, the second time without noticing he'd already made it, which was the kind of thing that happened when the part of your brain handling minor tasks was occupied with something else. "I'm focused," he said. That's a different word for the same thing. He'd kissed the top of her head, which she tolerated with the resigned dignity of a 13-year-old who had decided that certain parental behaviors were the cost of having a parent who showed up, and he'd driven to Washington. Well, the hearing room was functional and slightly airless, the way federal spaces tended to be. Fluorescent lighting, long tables, the particular institutional neutrality of rooms designed to process facts rather than feelings. The panel was 5 people, 2 aviation safety administrators, a military liaison, a civilian aviation attorney, and a retired federal judge who was chairing the proceedings with the practiced patience of someone who had been in rooms like this for 30 years and had stopped being surprised by anything. Calloway's legal team was present. They were 4 people. Senior partners from a firm Logan recognized from news coverage of defense industry cases, the kind of firm that charged rates that assumed the client had infinite resources, which Calloway, given the short-selling scheme, essentially had. The lead attorney was a man named Prescott, silver-haired, unhurried, with the courtroom composure of someone who had learned that juries and panels responded better to calm than to aggression. Logan had been warned about Prescott by Carver. She'd said, "He's very good at making accurate people sound like they're hiding something." Logan sat at the witness table and looked at the panel and felt the room settle into itself around him. Carver was at the prosecution table to his left. Prescott was across the room. The gallery had a scattering of people, industry observers, a few journalists, some Ashford Industries staff whose allegiances Logan couldn't immediately read. Victoria Ashford was in the third row of the gallery. She was alone, no assistants, no communication staff. She wore a dark coat over a simple blouse, and she looked at the room with the expression of someone who had made a decision about being present that had cost her something, and was paying the cost without complaint. Their eyes met briefly when Logan came in. She nodded, once. He nodded back. The panel's questions were methodical and thorough, the kind of questioning that moves through a technical record the way you disassemble an engine, component by component, establishing what each piece did and where it fit. Logan answered in the same register, precise, direct, without embellishment. He described what he'd found and when he'd found it, and what each piece of data indicated and why. He used plain language. He referenced the diagnostic report at every point where the record supported him, which was every point. Prescott's cross-examination began after the lunch break. He was exactly what Carver had warned about, measured, almost respectful in tone, the kind of attorney who understood that attacking a credible witness directly made juries sympathetic. He came at the edges instead. Mr. Mercer, you've described yourself throughout these proceedings as an aircraft mechanic. Licensed A and P mechanic, yes. And before that? I served in the United States Navy. In what capacity? A capacity that's classified. Prescott smiled slightly, not unkindly. Mr. Mercer, there's a flag on your military service record that has been the subject of some discussion in the press. We're not asking you to disclose classified operational details. We're asking whether your training and background in the Navy gave you interpretive frameworks that go beyond standard A and P certification. My A and P certification is what authorizes me to inspect and maintain civilian aircraft. That's what I was doing at Whitmore Executive Airfield. But your ability to identify the specific modification in the NAVCOM system to distinguish it from a legitimate post-installation adjustment that required more than A and P training, didn't it? It required looking at the timestamp and comparing it against the maintenance log, Logan said. That's a skill any competent inspector develops. The modification was designed to mimic legitimate software behavior. Our expert witness has testified that it would have passed standard inspection protocols. Standard protocols, yes. I went beyond standard protocols because the certification code was invalid. That's what flagged my attention. And your decision to go beyond standard protocols, is that something your A and P certification directs you to do, or is that a judgment call based on a broader set of skills? Logan looked at him steadily. It's a judgment call. I've been doing this work for 3 years. Judgment develops. From experience as a mechanic. From experience. Prescott moved to the next thing. He was building something slowly, the way you build something that you don't want anyone to see until it's finished. Mr. Mercer, after the aircraft departed against your recommendation, you made several phone calls. One of those calls was to a contact you've described only as someone from a long time ago. Can you tell us who that person is? The contact is a classified military liaison. Their identity is part of a sealed record. A classified military liaison, who you called from an airport parking lot after a civilian pre-departure inspection. Prescott paused just long enough. That's an unusual contact to have in your phone if you're an aircraft mechanic. I served in the Navy for 10 years. I have a lot of contacts. Contacts with access to Air Force Eastern Command. That contact was able to relay information quickly, yes. Mr. Mercer. Prescott changed direction. Is it possible that your involvement in this situation, your decision to pursue the aircraft, to board it mid-flight, to access the avionics system, was not entirely spontaneous? That you had perhaps a prior understanding of the situation that you haven't fully disclosed? The room shifted slightly. Logan felt it, the quality of attention changing, sharpening, the way it did when a question landed on something that the room was genuinely uncertain about. He looked at Prescott without expression. No, he said, it's not possible. You're certain. I'm certain of what I did and why I did it. I found a discrepancy in a maintenance log. I investigated it, I reported it. When the aircraft departed against my recommendation, I used every resource available to me to try to prevent harm to the people aboard. That's the complete account. Every resource available to a mechanic. Every resource available to me, Logan said. What I am is a mechanic. What I was before that is classified. Those are both true, and they're not in conflict. Prescott considered him for a moment. Then he said, "No further questions," and sat down, and the room exhaled in the way rooms exhale when they've been waiting for a blow that didn't land quite where it was aimed. The panel's findings took 3 weeks to publish. Logan read them on a Saturday morning at the kitchen table while Ellie slept in, which she did on weekends with the thoroughness of someone making up for every early school morning simultaneously. The findings were 47 pages. He read all of them. The panel found that the navigation modification was deliberate, sophisticated, and criminal in intent. It found that the pre-departure inspection report filed by Mercer Webb Technical was accurate, complete, and represented the appropriate professional standard for the inspection scope. It found that the departure decision made by Ashford Industries' CEO over the inspector's written objection reflected a pattern of prioritizing schedule over safety that warranted regulatory review. And it found that the actions taken by the inspector in pursuing the aircraft and correcting the navigation system, while extraordinary and outside standard professional scope, had directly prevented a multi-casualty incident and demonstrated the kind of independent technical judgment that aviation safety culture should foster rather than suppress. On page 31, there was a paragraph about Logan specifically. It noted his military background without specifying the nature of his service, acknowledged that his classified credentials had been verified through appropriate federal channels, and concluded that there was no evidence of prior knowledge or coordinated involvement in the incident. The panel found his testimony credible and his technical analysis sound. He read that paragraph twice. Then he set the report down and made coffee, this time just once, and looked out the window at the backyard where the last apple had finally fallen from the tree sometime in the past week. He hadn't seen it happen. It was just there one morning and gone the next. The way things that have been holding on a long time eventually let go when the conditions are right. The criminal proceedings took another 4 months. Logan testified twice, once in the preliminary hearing, once in the trial itself. Callaway's defense went through 3 variations of the same basic argument, each one slightly more attenuated than the last, until the weight of the forensic evidence made the variations unsustainable. Fenn's testimony was what broke it. Fenn had been in that room with Callaway when the plan was described to him. He remembered the specific language Callaway had used, the specific reasoning, the specific moment when Fenn had chosen to accept an explanation that he knew in some quiet part of himself was not quite right. He said all of this on the stand with the expression of a man who had had 4 months to sit with what he'd chosen not to know, and had arrived at something that wasn't absolution, but was at least honesty. Logan watched him testify and thought about Carver's words. People make decisions about what they're willing to know. He didn't feel contempt for Fenn. What he felt was something more complicated. The recognition that the willingness to not ask the right question was not a unique failure, but a common one, a human one, the specific weakness that careful, ambitious people sometimes carried without knowing it until it was too late to put down. Richard Callaway was convicted on 7 counts, including conspiracy to commit aviation sabotage, securities fraud, and criminal endangerment. The sentence was 22 years. The other executives received sentences ranging from 8 to 14 years, depending on their level of involvement in both the sabotage and the short-selling scheme. On the day the verdict came in, Logan was at work. A routine inspection at a regional carrier facility outside of Richmond? Nothing dramatic. The ordinary work of checking that the things that were supposed to hold were holding. Marcus texted him the news from a courthouse live stream he'd been watching on his phone. Logan read the text and put the phone back in his pocket and finished the inspection. On the drive home, he stopped at a grocery store and bought ingredients for dinner. Something real, not fast food, the kind of meal that required actual attention. He made pasta carbonara, which was one of 3 things he cooked reliably well, and Ellie ate 2 helpings and said it was good with the specific sincerity of someone who is capable of being critical but has decided this time not to be. "It's over," she said. "Not a question. The criminal part, yes. Is there a non-criminal part? There's always a non-criminal part," he said. "That's just life." She considered that. What happens to Victoria Ashford?
He'd been expecting the question. Ellie had followed the case the way she followed most things that interested her. Methodically, without advertising it. She'd read the panel findings. She'd watched the opening statements of the trial. She'd never mentioned any of it unless he brought it up first, which was a kind of tact that he appreciated more than he knew how to say. The board removed her, Logan said, about 3 weeks after the hearing. The safety record falsification, approving uncertified software to protect the contract timeline. That was enough for them. Was it right, removing her? He thought about that honestly. She made decisions that endangered people. The panel found a pattern of it, not just the navigation update. She approved things she shouldn't have approved because the schedule mattered more. That's on her. He paused. She also wasn't part of what Callaway built. She didn't know about it. She didn't benefit from it. And when she found out what had been done to her company, she cooperated fully with the investigation. Those things are also true. So she did something wrong, and something happened to her that was also wrong, and now she's gone. More or less. Ellie was quiet for a moment, turning her fork slowly. That's not a clean ending. No, Logan said. It isn't. Does that bother you? He thought about it, really thought about it, the way the question deserved. He thought about a woman in a charcoal blazer standing at a terminal window telling him that $2.4 billion was more important than his concerns, and about the same woman on an aircraft in the sky, standing with the controlled, deliberate effort of someone who had just discovered that the world she thought she'd built had a floor she hadn't known about. He thought about the flash of something that had moved behind her eyes on the tarmac. Not contempt, not quite, but something adjacent. And about the look on her face in the gallery at the hearing, alone in the third row, paying the cost of being present without complaint. Not the way it used to bother me, he said. He heard from her in March. A letter, actual paper, which surprised him. He'd expected a call, maybe an email, something transactional, something that could be brief. The letter was 3 pages, handwritten on plain stationery, the handwriting precise but not stiff, the kind of handwriting that revealed a person who had been formally educated and had also spent a lot of time under pressure. She wrote about the hearing, about sitting in the third row and listening to him describe what he'd found at Whitmore, and recognizing, for the first time with full clarity, how completely she had been wrong that morning. Not just professionally wrong, but wrong in the more basic way of having looked at a person and chosen not to see him. She wrote that she'd had 4 months to sit with that, and that the sitting had been instructive in ways that were uncomfortable and probably necessary. She wrote about what she was doing. She'd left Ashford Industries voluntarily before the board's decision, though the timing was close enough that it wouldn't look that way to most people. She was consulting on aviation safety policy, working with a nonprofit organization that advocated for independent inspection oversight in corporate aviation. The irony was not lost on her, she wrote. She intended to lean into it. She wrote near the end of the letter, I spent most of my professional life believing that judgment was the same as authority. That if you had the position and the experience and the track record, your judgment was entitled to override the concerns of people who had less of those things. I was wrong about that. It took a man in a gray coverall and a navigation system that someone had broken to show me what the difference actually was, and I'm not entirely sure I can articulate it even now, but I'm working on it. At the very end, she wrote, I don't know if an apology is what you need from me, but I want you to know that I know what I did, and I know what it would have cost, and I know that you came after us anyway. I don't have a category for that kind of person. I'm still trying to find one. Logan read the letter at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning. He read it twice, the way Marcus read technical documents. First for information, second for the thing underneath it. Then he wrote back. Not 3 pages. 1. He told her that the apology was received and that he understood the pressure she'd been under, even if he hadn't been willing to say that on the tarmac. He told her the work she was describing sounded like the right kind of work, that the gap between corporate aviation and meaningful safety oversight was real, and that someone with her operational experience and her hard-won understanding of where the failures lived could do genuine good in it. He told her he hoped she would. He sealed the envelope and set it on the counter to mail, and then Ellie came downstairs in her pajamas looking for cereal, and the morning moved forward the way mornings do. The government position came through Hendricks,
which was how Logan had half expected it to arrive. Indirectly, through a channel that had no official paperwork attached to the first conversation, so that the conversation could remain unofficial if he said no. It was a senior position in a new aviation security task force, interagency, focused specifically on cyber threats to civilian aircraft systems. The kind of position that didn't have a title yet because the division was still being built. The kind of work that was genuinely important and would remain genuinely invisible, which was exactly the right combination for a certain kind of person. Logan listened to the full description and said he was honored and would think about it. He thought about it for 2 weeks. What he thought about mostly was Ellie. Not in the simple way of, I can't take a demanding government position because I have a child. He'd learned over the years that that framing was too clean. The children were not simply constraints on adult ambition, but people with their own developing trajectories that you either supported or didn't, and that supporting them didn't always mean being physically present for every moment. He thought about what she was building, about the engineering diagrams in her textbooks, about the way she applied systems thinking to problems that weren't supposed to be systems problems, about the fact that she was going to go somewhere, college, career, a life of her own, and that the version of himself he wanted her to carry into that life was not a man who had hidden from the work he was built for, but a man who had done it honestly and with full knowledge of what it cost. He thought about 4 years in the quiet life, the lease on the house that he renewed every year without thinking too hard about whether it was permanent, the work that was clean and bounded and asked nothing of the person underneath the license number. He thought about a tarmac in October and the specific moral clarity of 12 people. He called Hendricks back on a Thursday afternoon and said he was declining the position. Hendricks was quiet for a moment. That's not the answer I expected. I know. Logan, what you did on that aircraft. I know what I did on that aircraft, Logan said. And I know I'm the kind of person who can do that kind of thing. But I've been thinking about where the problem actually starts. And it doesn't start in the air. It starts on the ground, in maintenance bays and inspection reports, and the gap between what the paperwork says and what someone actually did. That's where someone needs to be. You're staying in inspection work. I'm building something, Logan said. An independent organization, aviation safety focus, specifically on the corporate and private sector, where oversight is weakest. The gap between what the FAA requires and what actually gets checked before these aircraft fly is bigger than most people know. I want to close it. That's important work, Hendricks said. It's also not what you were built for. I was built for a lot of things, Logan said. I get to choose which ones. A pause. You'd be good at both. Probably. But my daughter lives in Richmond, and she has 2 more years of high school, and I'm not done being there for them. He stopped. The task force will find someone else. What I'm talking about, I'm not sure anyone else is going to do. Another pause, longer. Then Hendricks said, You know where to find me if you change your mind. I do, Logan said. Thank you. He hung up and sat in the kitchen and looked at the backyard. The apple tree had survived another winter, bare and patient. The way trees that have been through winters know to be patient with them. There would be apples again eventually. Maybe more than 3. 10. He registered the organization in April. Meridian, to their credit, provided a letter of support. Formal, careful. The kind of institutional backing that comes from an organization that has calculated the reputational benefit of being associated with someone whose name had cleared. Logan accepted it without ceremony. He wasn't interested in the optics. He was interested in the work. He spent the spring building the framework, not from scratch. There were pieces of existing infrastructure he could build on, relationships from his inspection years, technical resources from contacts he'd accumulated across a decade in aviation. Marcus came on as the first senior inspector, on the condition that Logan buy the beers he'd been promised. Logan bought them. He called the organization Clearsight Aviation Safety, which was a name Ellie had suggested one evening while she was supposedly doing homework, tossed out with the casual precision of someone who had been thinking about it without announcing it. He used it without telling her he was going to, and when she saw it on the registration documents, she gave him a look that was equal parts pleased and exasperated, which was more or less the look she gave him most often. The first contract came from a regional airline that had been involved in a near miss 2 years earlier and had been trying ever since to build an independent safety review process that their insurance carrier would actually trust. The second came from a corporate flight department that had read the Ashford Industries case coverage and decided that whatever Logan Mercer had found in 6 hours on an airport tarmac, they wanted someone like that looking at their aircraft on a regular basis. The work was not glamorous. It was methodical and detailed and frequently frustrating, because the problems it uncovered were usually not dramatic, not routing subroutines inserted by ambitious executives with short positions, but smaller failures, the ordinary erosion of standards that happened when organizations prioritized cost and schedule over the boring, essential, unglamorous work of making sure everything was what it said it was. Certification codes that didn't quite match, sign-offs that arrived too quickly, maintenance logs with gaps that nobody had asked about, because asking about them slowed things down. Logan asked about all of them. On a Friday afternoon in September, almost a year exactly, from the morning at Whitmore, Logan picked Ellie up from school. She got in the car with the particular energy of someone who has been waiting to say something and has been exercising restraint about it. "I got into the summer engineering program," she said. He looked at her. The one at the university, yes, the selective one. The one I told you about in June." She was trying to be calm about it and failing, the same way she'd failed to conceal being impressed by his suit, the same way she failed at most deceptions because she was fundamentally too direct to sustain them. "I got in. Ellie." He said her name without the rest of the sentence, because the rest of the sentence was something he didn't have the right words for. Not congratulations, which was too small, and not I'm proud of you, which was too easy, but something in between that had to do with watching a person become more fully themselves than they were the last time you looked. "I know," she said. "I'm excited too." "You should be." "I am." She looked out the window. "Dad, the thing you're building, clear sight." "What about it?" "When I finish engineering, when I'm actually qualified, I want to work on it." He looked at her sideways. "That's 5 years away." 6, probably. "I want to do it right." She turned to face him with the directness she'd carried since she was old enough to form sentences. "You spent 4 years being quiet and small because that's what was safe. I don't want to do that. I want to do the actual thing." "You're 13. I'm almost 14. The actual thing is a lot of boring maintenance log reviews and arguments with flight department managers who don't want to hear what you found. "I know. I read your reports." She said this simply. "I've been reading them since June, the ones you leave on the kitchen table." He hadn't known that. He thought he'd been careful about it. "Those are confidential documents." "They were face up," she said. "I didn't go looking." He drove for a moment in silence. The Virginia September was doing what Virginia September did. Warm enough to still feel like summer, but with something underneath it that wasn't summer. A sharpness in the air that came from the direction of October. "You can't read confidential documents," he said. "I know, I won't anymore." She paused. "But the work is good, Dad. It's real. I want to do real things." He thought about that. About a 13-year-old, almost 14, who read aircraft safety inspection reports face up on kitchen tables and thought about systems and applied engineering thinking to the problem of her father's reputation and said, "I want to do real things with the absolute certainty of someone who has always known what real means and is just waiting to be old enough to get there." He thought about the version of himself at her age, what he'd known and what he'd been waiting for, how long the waiting had felt, and how fast the arriving had gone. 6 years, he said. 6 years, she agreed. "Then we'll talk." She looked satisfied. Not triumphantly satisfied, but the settled satisfaction of someone who has said the important thing and received a response that means it was heard. She looked back out the window at the passing September afternoon, and Logan drove and did not say what he was thinking, which was that the conversation they'd just had was one of the best conversations of his year and probably his decade. There's a thing that happens to people who spend years carrying something heavy. Not a dramatic thing, not a turning point with clean edges, but a slow and imperfect redistribution. The weight doesn't disappear. You don't put it down. But over time, if you're fortunate, you find a way to carry it that doesn't require you to walk bent. Logan Mercer was not a man who had found peace in any particular moment. He had not had an epiphany on a tarmac or a resolution in a courtroom or a conversation with his daughter that suddenly organized everything into sense. What he had was the accumulation of ordinary days, the texture of work that mattered, and a child who was growing into someone who understood why it mattered, and the quiet knowledge that when the moment had come, when the $40 million jet had lifted off and taken 12 people with it, he had not looked away. That was the thing, finally. Not the heroism, which was a word that didn't fit the way the situation actually felt from inside it. Not the credentials, classified or otherwise, that had made certain things possible. Not the outcome, which was good but imperfect, and would have consequences that would unspool for years in ways he couldn't predict. It was the not looking away. He had looked at what was in front of him and called it what it was and done what the situation required, without waiting for someone to authorize him to do it, without calculating whether it was within his documented scope, without asking whether the people who needed help were people who deserved it from him specifically. He had done it because 12 people were on a jet, and he was the person who knew what was wrong with it, and those two facts together made the choice simple, even when the execution was complicated. That was the only real thing he'd ever figured out about integrity. Not that it was comfortable, not that it was rewarded, but that it was simple. Simpler than its absence, in the end. The complicated lives were the ones built around not doing the straightforward thing, around the careful construction of reasons why the thing in front of you was not your problem. Those lives required constant maintenance. They were exhausting in ways that the people living them often couldn't see because the exhaustion had become the baseline. Logan's baseline was a gray coverall and a diagnostic tablet and a daughter who read his inspection reports off the kitchen table and thought about systems. That was enough. It was more than enough. He had come to understand exactly what a life was supposed to feel like when it was being lived in the right direction. On the last weekend of October, a year and 3 weeks from the morning at Whitmore, Logan drove Ellie to an open house at the university that ran the summer engineering program. They walked through labs and listened to faculty presentations, and Ellie asked questions that made the faculty members look at her with the particular attention that competent people give to someone who has asked a question they didn't expect. On the drive home, the sun was going down in the way October suns went down in Virginia, low and amber, stretching the light across everything until the ordinary looked briefly like something else. "You're going to be good at this," Logan said. "I know," Ellie said. Then, after a moment, "You are too." "I've been at it 32 years. Not the mechanic stuff," she said. "The other stuff. The being a person stuff." He looked at the road. "I've made a lot of mistakes. Everyone does." She pulled her knees up to the seat, which he usually told her not to do in the car, and decided tonight not to. "The thing that matters is what you did after." He thought about the tarmac, about the diagnostic cable and the cold coffee and the T-38 lifting off a Navy runway while Marcus watched from a van in the parking lot, about a letter on plane stationery in a courtroom in Washington and a document in April with the name Clearsight across the top, about a borrowed flight suit with another man's name on it that he'd eventually returned by mail with a handwritten note that he hoped Vasquez would understand. "What you did after." "Yeah," he said. "I think that's right." The road went on through the amber October light. His daughter sat beside him in the front seat of a car that needed its left rear tire rotated, which he'd been meaning to do for 2 weeks and would probably do tomorrow. And the evening moved around them in the way evenings moved when nothing dramatic was happening and nothing needed to. This was the ending, not the verdict or the letter or the registered organization or the government position declined. This, a car on a Virginia road in the fall, a father and a daughter going home. The ordinary mechanics of a life rebuilt from the decision to do the right thing when it was inconvenient and unglamorous and nobody was going to thank you for it. He had spent 4 years being smaller than he was. He didn't intend to do that again. Not because he'd become someone different, but because he'd finally admitted to being who he already was. That was all it had taken in the end. That, and one gray coverall, and a maintenance log that didn't add up.